Job loses everything in 2 days. His children, his wealth, his health, and then nothing. For 7 chapters, his friends talk. And for most of those chapters, they sound completely reasonable. That is the problem nobody mentions. Because if you read Job the way most people read it, as a story about suffering and patience, you will miss the structure entirely. And missing the structure means you will misidentify the villain. Not Satan. Not God. Someone else. Someone sitting right there in the text, speaking in full paragraphs, quoting theology correctly, and getting it completely wrong. The book of Job is not primarily a book about why people suffer. It is a book about how we talk about suffering. And those are not the same thing. To understand what Job actually is, you need to step back from the content and look at the form. Job is one of the oldest texts in the Hebrew Bible. Scholars date its composition, or at least its core poem, somewhere between the 7th and 5th centuries BCE, though the story itself may be far older. The name Job appears in texts outside Israel. In an Egyptian execration text from roughly 2000 BCE, in a cuneiform tablet from ancient Ugarit. This is not a specifically Israelite story. It was always meant to be universal. And here is the first thing the structure tells you. The book of Job is not one literary genre. It is 3, braided together. There is a prose, frame the opening 2 chapters and the closing epilogue. Simple sentences, third-person narration. A narrator who knows everything, including what happened in the divine council. This section reads like ancient folklore, like a story you have heard before. Then there is the poetic core, 35 chapters of dense, difficult Hebrew verse. The vocabulary of the poem is unlike almost anything else in the Old Testament. Scholars have counted dozens of words that appear only here, nowhere else in the entire Hebrew Bible. Some of these words are so rare that translators still debate what they mean. And then, beginning in chapter 32, there is a third voice, Elihu. A young man who appears from nowhere, speaks for 6 chapters, and is never mentioned again. Not in the opening, not in God's response, not in the epilogue. That omission is not an accident. Now here is what most people miss. The poetic core of Job chapters 3 through 31 is arranged as a formal debate. 3 rounds, 3 friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. Each takes a turn. Job responds. Then the next friend. Then Job again. 3 full cycles. Except the 3rd cycle breaks. In the 3rd round, Bildad's speech is only 6 verses long. And Zophar disappears entirely. He simply does not speak. The formal structure collapses. The debate fractures before it can be completed. This is intentional. The author is doing something precise here. The friends run out of things to say, not because they are silenced by Job, but because their theology has nothing left to offer. They have said everything their system allows them to say, and it was not enough. Read the speeches of Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar carefully, not for what is wrong with them, but for what is right. They quote real theology. They reference genuine truths about God's holiness and human sinfulness. They are not heretics. They are not malicious. They are doing what most religious people do when they encounter unexplained suffering. They are trying to explain it. And that is exactly the problem. There is a word in Hebrew teshuvah. It means both answer and return. In Job, the same root appears in the friends' speeches and in God's final response. But the function is completely different. The friends demand teshuvah from Job a return, a repentance, an explanation that fits their categories. God's teshuvah at the end, the whirlwind speech, offers no explanation at all. God does not answer Job's questions. Read chapters 38 through 41 carefully. God responds with more questions. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Have you entered the storehouses of the snow? Do you know the ordinances of the heavens? This is not evasion. This is the point. The friends believe suffering required an explanation. They believe the universe operated on a principle of strict moral cause and effect, a system so reliable that you could run it backwards. Suffering in a person's life meant sin in a person's past, always, without exception. Job refused that framework. Not because he was righteous, he knew he was not perfect, but because he knew the equation did not work that way. He had watched it fail in real life. And he said so, loudly, in ways that made his friends deeply uncomfortable. Here is the structure's secret. At the end, God does not rebuke Job. God rebukes the friends. You have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. Job 42-7. That verse has puzzled readers for centuries. Job questioned God more directly than anyone in the Old Testament. He said things that sound almost like accusations. And God calls that righteous speech because Job was being honest. The friends were defending a theological system. Job was wrestling with a real God. There is a difference between talking about God correctly and talking to God honestly. The friends chose the first. Job chose the second. And the structure of the entire book was designed to show you why that matters. Maybe you are reading this in a season that does not make sense. Maybe you have been given the friend's answer by a pastor, by a parent, by your own internal voice at 3 a.m. There must be a reason. There must be something you did. There must be a lesson God is trying to teach you. And maybe underneath the exhaustion part of you knows that is not enough. Job does not give you an explanation. Neither does God. The book of Job was never meant to explain your suffering. It was meant to tell you something more uncomfortable and more freeing than that. The universe is larger than your categories, and the God who built it is not threatened by your questions. The friends spoke carefully, theologically, correctly, and God rejected their words. Job screamed into the void, demanded answers, said things that made everyone around him uncomfortable, and God called it righteous speech. The book is not telling you to stop questioning. It is telling you to stop performing. Job loses everything in 2 days. At the end of the book, he gets it back. Children, wealth, years. The epilogue is brief and warm, and almost uncomfortable after everything that preceded it. But notice what the epilogue does not give back. An explanation. We never learn why. The Satan, the accuser, disappears from the story after chapter 2, and is never mentioned again. The divine council scene is never referenced in the epilogue. Job never finds out what we found out in the first chapter. He never gets the answer. He gets something else. He gets God. And the book's secret structure, the framing, the broken debate cycle, the sudden appearance and disappearance of Elihu, the whirlwind speech that answers nothing and everything, all of it was designed to leave you exactly where Job was left. In the middle of the unanswered question, in the presence of someone who does not owe you an explanation, and somehow, inexplicably, at peace. If this kind of study is something you want to go deeper with, there is a link below to support the channel. Every video like this takes days of research, and your support makes it possible to keep going. Next time, we are going to look at the character of Elihu, the voice that appears from nowhere, and why his presence in the text might be the most theologically loaded puzzle in the entire book.